Amid months-long violence sparked by presidential ambition, Burundi seeks a way forward. How can the African nation find peace? Hello, I'm Nathan King in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hi, Burundi's crisis may have begun with political protests, but there are foreboding signs for what may lie ahead. Suggestions of interference from abroad, increasing ethnic elements to the bloodshed, warnings that a full-scale civil war, even genocide, may follow. CCTV's Giram Chala begins our coverage with an update.
It was last April when Burundi erupted into crisis following the decision by President Pierre Nkurunziza to seek a third term in office. More than 400 people have lost their lives in the violence so far, though some claim the toll is much higher. Nearly 250,000 people have fled the country. Burundi's former president Pierre Buyoya served during much of the country's protracted civil war that pit Hutus against Tutsis and did not end until 2006. He says it's urgent the country address the conflict.
Two things. One is to stop violence, because the level of violence is too high. Many people are dying. If it does continue, we are going straight into civil war, maybe into genocide. Second, to accept inclusive dialogue.
Trying to contain the violence and above all prevent a possible genocide, the African Union Peace and Security Council announced in December it would deploy a 5,000-member peacekeeping force to Burundi, but the plan was immediately rejected by Burundian authorities. The African Union has continental military and human rights observers in Burundi, and they report all the happenings weekly, including daily incident reports. Officials say all the information coming out of the country points to the urgent need for intervention, either from the continent or the international community, to avoid a possible civil war. Grumtala CCTV, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
And 5 African leaders travelled to Burundi last week to push for peace talks just days after UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was in Bujumbura urging President Pierre Nkurunziza to open dialogue. The Burundian government agreed to allow 200 more African Union military and human rights monitors into the country. It's a small compromise, but a sign the government is open to assistance from regional and world partners to end the violence. Joining us now from Nairobi is Nanjala Nyabola, a Kenyan writer involved in multi-dimensional research into conflict in Africa. And from Johannesburg, we have Bob Wakesa. He's an expert in African foreign relations. With me in the studio is Fred Oladende. He is president of the Foundation for Democracy in Africa. And lastly, from Cape Town is Patrick Hajayandi, a senior project leader for the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation and a researcher with the World Bank. He also travelled to Burundi to study the role of family on former combatants. Patrick, let's start with you. You've been on the ground in Burundi quite a bit. Obviously, most people around the world remember Burundi for the brutal civil war over a decade ago. We've also had this constitutional crisis. Are there any parallels between the civil war and what could erupt in Burundi right now?
What I can say about Burundi is that the country has a history of conflict, and this has been going on for a very long time, especially since the independence of the country. And there has not been any sustainable solution since that time. So what is going on today is a political crisis that was sparked by the willingness of the incumbent president to be re-elected for a third term. And this sparked a lot of demonstrations, especially in the city of Bujumbura, which at a given time became violent, and the police and the security forces and the army were obliged to intervene, sometimes with a lot of violence, and this is what created the political situation we are seeing today in the country. So it's a problem that I can say it's a cycle of violence that we have been seeing in the country, which has not found a solution until today. This is what we see.
Nanjala in Nairobi, I just want to bring you in because you're an expert on reconciliation. Just a few years ago with the Arusha Accords in Burundi, there was real hope that the ethnic tensions between Hutu and Tutsi had been put to bed. There was power sharing. Is all that now under threat? And what's your way forward, do you think, in terms of the African Union? Because there have been some muddled messages from the African Union and the international community as to the way forward.
I think the most interesting thing was the Arusha Accords had in some way brought some kind of stability to Burundi. The last 10 years have been some of, as Patrick said, have been some of the most stable years in Burundi's history, certainly since independence. And so I think the reading of the general sentiments among Burundians was that they had hoped that the Arusha Accords would be a full stop to these cycles of violence. And what is really under threat here, beyond just political instability, is really the feeling, the general feeling in the population that the conflict, the long-running conflict, had finally been over. And you're absolutely right about the mixed signals coming from the African Union. And I think it is partly because the African Union itself is pretty divided on how it wants to proceed on the issue of resolving conflicts in African countries. Burundi is a contributor to peacekeeping in the African Union. It is very active in Somalia. It is very active in South Sudan. And it's very difficult for the African Union to come out strongly against any country, regardless how small, that relies on for peacekeeping contributions, when most of the other countries in the Union have been reluctant to produce troops, even to go to Burundi. So I think, yes, it's definitely we're getting a schizophrenic mixed message from the African Union, and it's something that I think has contributed to the prolongation of this crisis, and is something that it's probably the most not inconstructive thing that could have happened at this point.
Bob Wekese in Johannesburg, the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, led leaders of Africa to the region recently. It's all really about putting regional pressure on a solution. Is that working?
Right. I think the African Union is taking up this as its problem. You know, the adage goes that we need African solutions to African problems. And initially, when in December, the African Union indicated that they are going to send the 5,000 strong intervention force in December, there was an indication that they will take the force to Burundi whether or not the Pierre Nkurunziza regime agreed or not, that they had no choice in the matter. But as you know, subsequently in January, when there was the African Union Heads of State conference, they backed off that, which was an indication that perhaps Burundi was quietly undertaking quiet diplomacy vis-a-vis the coercive kind of approach that the African Union had decided to take. And at the January meeting of the heads of state of in Africa meeting, it was decided that the 4 heads of state will go to Burundi, which happened last week. You find that the statement that came out does not give you lots of optimism, because it was wishy-washy. It's as if the President Nkurunziza remained adamant on certain key points, so that they just talk about their 100 human rights observers and the 100 military experts that will be sent to Burundi, and not much more, really.
Fred,
so I'm sorry, I'm a bit pessimistic of that. Yeah.
Well, there is room for pessimism in this, obviously. Fred, here in the studio, the African Union has seemed to have a choice, obviously, whether to go in decisively and quickly, but as Fred was saying, that could also lead to a cataclysm, or to try and manage the crisis. Is the situation in Burundi at a point now where things need to act faster, or are monitors enough, considering also that some reports of the monitors that are already there aren't really leaving their hotels. So,
Then I think what we're seeing here, based on Bujumbura refusal to the Peace and Security Council,
the African Union Peace and Security Council,
deployment of 5,000 standby troops, and which they vigorously protested, saying they have enough troops to be able to handle the peace and security within Burundi. So in order to manage the chaos and for it to not deteriorate, I think the African Union decided during the summit under the new chairmanship of President Derby of Chad that they would send a high-level delegation which President Zuma was asked to go in, not only to speak with the President, Pierre Nkurunziza, but also to meet with other stakeholders and to be able to evolve a process that would lead into dialogue. The solution to Burundi is going to have to be dialogue, because we are in a quagmire situation right now.
Nanjala in Nairobi, I want to put you back on that point. Obviously, reconciliation between the political parties is what, and also the different ethnic groups is what people are after. Has the African Union got a plan to try and bring in some of the Tutsi groups that feel that they've been pushed out of this process when Pierre Nkurunziza got his third term? Is there a plan on the ground, or is it really trying to manage events because everything is so unstable?
Well, I think at this point, at least from the outside, it looks like they're simply trying to manage events. One of the points that Nkurunziza has been very firm on is that he does not want to negotiate with the group, the CNRD, that has been recognized as the primary opposition figure. And that's really a sticking point, because these are the people who have come out strongest and most vocally against his third term, and yet most of them are still in exile. And so by refusing to negotiate with them, Nkurunziza has actually complicated things that in other situations might have been pretty straightforward. Get everybody around the table and get them to agree on an exit plan. And more than anything else, that's what makes the situation in Burundi more complicated. All of the things that would be in a reconciliation playbook, all of the things that we would go to first in terms of bringing people together, in terms of sending in peacekeepers, in terms of getting a government of national unity in place, all of those things are off the table as long as Nkurunziza remains intransigent and sees himself as the only person who is capable of leading Burundi. I believe that really getting people around the table should be a priority, but without the guarantee of safety, without the agreement to release prisoners, his prison release program did not include anybody who was quote unquote arrested for treason. Without that kind of agreement, that kind of goodwill gesture on his part, I just see it as being very difficult to move forward in terms of reconciliation, as long as he's not willing to budge on these key points that the opposition, or what has been recognized as the official opposition, even by Yoweri Museveni, is not at the table.
Patrick Hajiane in Cape Town, do you agree that steps need to be taken on the ground in Bujumbura, the Burundian capital, first in terms of trust building, releasing of prisoners, reaching out between the political parties before the African Union and the region has any hope of success?
I want to react on a number of points. First of all is that when the decision to deploy the 5,000 troops in Burundi was taken, I think there was no real assessment which has been done on the ground to know whether these forces is needed. Because for people who have not been in Burundi, in the capital Bujumbura especially, they cannot understand what is going on without being on the ground. So I have been there since the end of the year. I have been in Bujumbura in December and in January, especially at the end of January. So I saw how the situation is evolving. It's not a situation really which needs the deployment of troops. That's the reality on the ground. And additional to that, the recent research that has been done by the ACLED has shown that the violence actually is decreasing significantly within the country. So what happened is that there have been a a change within the armed groups which have been claiming to have vowed to oust President Nkurunziza, because there are groups of people who are coming in town handing over their weapons to the security forces and the police, because what happened is that the problem has evolved in a way that the initial issue regarding the third term of the president is no longer on the agenda, but it seems as if the regional dimension of the conflict, taking into account, for example, the issue around the arming of the refugees from the camps in the neighboring countries, is taking over, and the problem is having a more regional dimension. Especially on the diplomatic level, but not in terms of violence. In Bujumbura, the situation shows that the violence is decreasing. So what we see then within the decision of the African Union has been some decision taken based on information that has been being spread, especially by the opposition, which is outside, but which has a more political dimension than the real issue that you see on the ground.
Patrick, I'm just going to have to stop you there because it's time to take a break, but we will talk more about the regional dimensions when we come up. Coming up, more from our panel for the future of Burundi and, of course, the whole of the Great Lakes region. A decade after escaping civil war, is it destined to repeat its civil war? We'll explain and explore next. Stay with us on The Heat. Welcome back. We're discussing Burundi's political and social upheaval, and back to our panel. And Fred, let's pick up with you in the studio. There is a regional dimension to this crisis. As we know, the region is split along ethnic lines, Hutus and Tutsis as well. And Burundi has accused neighboring Rwanda, led by Paul Kagame, who's a Tutsi, of involvement. Let's just have a listen to Pierre Nkurunziza on that.
We spoke about other issues facing the region, especially Rwanda, which is a country that has been causing us problems. We asked for UN support to help us regarding Rwanda, to stop provoking us, so we can go back to having good neighborly relations like we used to.
Fred, obviously these accusations are a real problem, finger-pointing. Could the region explode again?
I think the current situation in the region needs to be properly managed, and that's why I am very impressed that just this few days ago, yesterday, that President Benjamin Mkapa has been brought in as the special mediator. As you know, he was president from 1993 to 2005. In Tanzania.
Which of course authored the Arusha Accords.
The Arusha Accord. And the solution to the situation in Burundi is going to be found in the Arusha Accord, despite some of the challenges that we face now. I am also happy that as the EAC meeting was taking place yesterday, that the United Nations investigators team arrived and looking at killings that have occurred in Burundi. I think these are all important signals that has to be sent to all stakeholders, that there is going to be definitely consequences for acts that have been committed. In terms of the issues between Burundi and Rwanda, the president of Burundi has accused and pointed fingers at Rwanda. Rwanda, on his own part, and I remember the Foreign Minister Louise of Rwanda has also then decided that they would start looking at alternative relocation for refugees. As you know, we have almost 240,000 displaced people, and Rwanda is responsible for housing some of these refugees.
And how they behave too.
And how they behave. It would be very nice if we could be provided more information based on Burundi.
Bubble Kessler in Johannesburg, what about the regional dimensions in this? Rwanda is a regional powerhouse, do not see eye to eye with Pierre Nkurunziza, and also other players in the region and internationally.
Right, I think, but first of all, just to touch a bit on what Patrick was saying earlier, I think we risk the danger of sweeping a problem as huge as is happening in Burundi. We say things are fine, or the things are, the situation is being managed and things are getting to normal. Like my colleague has just mentioned now, we have 240,000+ refugees out there. We have well over 40 people dead. We are discovering mass graves and so forth. So I think the gravity of the situation is such that we shouldn't, take it as lightly as my colleague Patrick was putting it earlier. Now, coming to the regional dimension of this all, I think we've flogged and pointed out the point that the African Union is doing its best from a regional perspective, to perhaps even in terms of image, to be seen to be doing something before the wider international community, in the sense of the UN, for example, comes in, and that's a good step. I mean, even it could do better, but at least there's something happening on that front.
In terms of the region, it's very interesting that not just in Burundi, but in Rwanda, Uganda and elsewhere, there is this big discussion about third-termism or more in terms of African leaders trying to seek to change the constitutional limits on their thing. Do you think this is actually part of the problem, obviously not just in Burundi, but regionally as well, and is slowing down perhaps the solving of these problems?
Well, it's interesting. If you think about East Africa as a region, actually, East Africa has had the lowest incidence of third-termism. We have relatively. Again, relatively is a big word. So you have the three Great Lakes countries. You have Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi sort of grappling with these issues in different directions and having different historical trajectories. But generally, the region has, prior to the last 5-6 years, had a reputation for being one of the more democratic regions of the developing world, not just in Africa. So you've had electoral transitions in Tanzania since Nyerere passing. You've had complicated, but still we've had transitions in Kenya. Even in Somalia, they're now grappling with elections. They've had a change of government, etc. So there was, certainly in the mid-2000s, there was this optimism that East Africa could somehow become a beacon of democracy and electoral change and follow in the footsteps of Southern Africa, which has had a little bit more of a reputation for this. Third-termism is an interesting thing. I think it's driven by different things. Certainly personality is a big part of it. This is what we're seeing in Burundi. This is what we're seeing in Rwanda. This is what we're seeing in Uganda. This indispensability complex that comes from leading a country out of crisis. This idea that this leader, because I oversaw this moment of turmoil, I am the rightful, quote-unquote, owner of this country. And that's not something that you can manage necessarily with political processes. That is something that you manage on an individual basis. And I think this is an opportunity in Burundi that perhaps needs to be explored a little bit more. The fact that Nkurunziza, one of the things that's driving him is that he believes that he has been called by God to save Burundi. And that is a call on the religious community, on churches, to jump in and show some kind of leadership on this personality issue.
I just want to bring in Patrick here. Is the personality of Pierre Nkurunziza at the heart of this?
I think the personality of Nkurunziza especially has been a key specifically for his political party, the CNDD, because he has been someone who is very close to the population, especially the rural population. And as you can remember, Burundi has more than 90% of the total population living in the rural area. So he has been able to mobilize the masses. And that has been, I think, a key to the fact that his political party presented him again as the candidate, because what we see is that CNDD-FDD has not prepared anyone who was able to mobilize the population as Nkurunziza is able to do.
I just want to bring in Fred here for a final word. You know, with all this happening in Burundi and the tension in the region, one thing that does suffer, of course, is development in Africa. How much does instability in Burundi and elsewhere in the Great Lakes region, of course, mean that development from the outside world, much needed development, is actually not coming through?
Before I address that, I just want to be very clear with Bob Wakisa that my point here is not that the situation in Burundi is managed, but that it needs to be managed, so we do not get into civil war and chaos.
You weren't downplaying it?
We're not downplaying it. We are in a very bad situation, but if we remember, between 1993 and 2005, we had almost 300,000 people that were killed in the civil war. So we should, as much as possible, use all efforts, diplomacy, international intervention, to try to prevent another genocide and another killing of 300,000.
I think that's everything. Everyone agrees on that. So what about the development of Africa, that region of Africa, being put on hold while this crisis happens?
And that's really the problem, because as Burundi was evolving between 2005 and 2015, we've now seen another monkey wrench in the development efforts of Burundi. The major export of Burundi is tea, coffee, and nickel, and of course uranium that they do have. There must be concerted effort to bring the development agenda of Burundi, which is going to impact on all of the 10-point-something million people of Burundi. And this, the African Union effort, the EAC effort, and the efforts of the international community should be to help Burundi transition through this, using all of the agreements that are within the Arusha Accord, to find a solution so that we could have development as the main focus of the people of Burundi.
Fred Oladende here in the studio. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank all our guests in Africa, Njala Nyabola, also Bob Bukesa out of Johannesburg, and of course Patrick Hajayande out of Cape Town as well. That's all we have time for. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks for being with us on The Heat.